put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The Banker's Confession. In the depths of a Palermo courthouse, hidden among thousands of confiscated documents, investigators discovered something that made their blood run cold. A single ledger, unremarkable in appearance, but within its pages lay the blueprint for what financial experts would later call the most sophisticated criminal financial system ever created. The Sicilian Mafia hadn't just learned to wash dirty money. They had invented an entirely new language of wealth, one that would teach legitimate businesses, corrupt politicians, and even foreign governments how to make billions disappear in plain sight. This is the dark business story of how organized crime didn't just infiltrate the global financial system, they built it. The story begins not with violence, but with a problem. By the 1950s, the Sicilian Mafia, known as Cosa Nostra, controlled vast criminal enterprises spanning heroin trafficking, extortion, prostitution, and gambling. The syndicate generated astronomical profits, estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars annually in today's currency. But there was a fatal flaw in their business model. Cash. Mountains of it. Sitting in warehouses, buried in fields, stuffed in walls. Useless, because dirty money that can't be spent might as well not exist. The Mafia faced what every criminal organization eventually confronts: the money laundering problem. How do you transform illegitimate wealth into legitimate assets without leaving a trail that leads straight to prison? The answer would come from an unlikely source: a brilliant accountant with ice in his veins, and a vision that would reshape global finance forever. His name was Michele Sindona, and he understood something fundamental about the modern world. Money doesn't care where it comes from. Born in Sicily in 1920, Sindona possessed a rare combination of financial genius and moral flexibility. By the 1960s, he had become the Mafia's chief financial architect, the man who would build the infrastructure for what experts now call the golden age of money laundering. But Sindona's brilliance lay not in hiding money, but in understanding that the best way to launder cash wasn't to conceal it. It was to legitimize it through institutions that society trusted implicitly. Banks. He began acquiring small financial institutions throughout Italy, seemingly legitimate operations that served everyday customers. Behind the marble counters and professional facades, these banks became sophisticated washing machines for mafia cash. The technique was elegant in its simplicity. Mafia money would enter as deposits from shell companies, flow through complex international transfers, and emerge as clean capital, ready for investment in legitimate businesses: hotels, construction companies, restaurants, real estate. But Sindona didn't stop at Italy. He understood that true financial invisibility required global reach. In 1972, he acquired Franklin National Bank in New York, then the 20th largest bank in the United States. A mafia accountant now controlled a major American financial institution. The audacity was breathtaking. Through Franklin National, mafia money could now flow freely between continents, disguised as legitimate international banking transactions. Sindona created an intricate web of correspondent banking relationships, connecting Sicily to Switzerland, Switzerland to the Bahamas to New York, New York back to Italy. Each transfer added layers of legitimacy, making the original source virtually untraceable. Prosecutors would later describe it as financial sorcery. But the true genius of Sindona's system lay in something darker, something that revealed the fundamental corruption at the heart of global finance. He hadn't forced his way into the banking system. He'd been welcomed. The Vatican. the Pope's own bank. This is where the business thriller becomes almost incomprehensible in its darkness. Sindona cultivated a relationship with Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, head of the Vatican Bank, formerly known as the Institute for the Works of Religion. The Vatican Bank possessed something invaluable: complete sovereignty and total banking secrecy laws that made Swiss banks look transparent by comparison. No government could audit it. No regulator could examine its books. It was the perfect node in a money laundering network. Through his Vatican connections, Sindona helped establish an arrangement where mafia money could be deposited in accounts at the Vatican Bank, then transferred to his network of institutions worldwide, with the implied blessing of the Holy See itself. The moral absurdity was staggering. The spiritual heart of Catholicism serving as a laundromat for heroin profits and murder proceeds. But for Sindona and his mafia partners, it was simply good business. By the early 1970s, the Sicilian Mafia had achieved something unprecedented in criminal history. They didn't just have a money laundering operation. They had built a parallel banking system. The scale was almost incomprehensible. Prosecutors would later estimate that between 1970 and 1980, the Mafia laundered somewhere between $30 and $60 billion through Sindona's network. Billion, with a B. This wasn't just washing drug money. This was processing sums larger than the GDP of many nations. The operations were surgical in their precision. Mafia heroin trafficking would generate massive cash flows in the United States. That cash would be deposited in seemingly legitimate businesses. Pizza parlors became particularly popular fronts, creating what investigators called the pizza connection. The businesses would claim high revenues, deposit the cash in banks, then wire transfer it overseas as payment for imports. Once the money reached Sicily, it would fragment through multiple accounts, flow through Swiss banks with numbered accounts, cycle through Vatican bank transfers, and eventually return to the United States as clean investment capital from European investors. The Mafia would then purchase legitimate assets: shopping centers, apartment buildings, casinos. With money that now appeared completely legal, they had weaponized complexity itself. But there was a problem growing in the shadows, one that would eventually expose the entire operation and reveal the shocking vulnerability at the center of their empire: greed. Sindona, drunk on his own brilliance and power, began taking increasingly reckless risks. He started using depositors' money for unauthorized speculation in foreign currency markets, betting millions on Deutsche Mark and Lira fluctuations. In 1974, his gambles collapsed catastrophically. Franklin National Bank, the Mafia's crown jewel in the American financial system, hemorrhaged $200 million in losses. It became the largest bank failure in American history at that time. Federal regulators descended like wolves. What they discovered in Franklin's books made their investigation into simple bank failure transform into something far more sinister: evidence of massive fraud, securities manipulation, and transfers that made no business sense unless you understood their true purpose. The perfect money laundering machine was beginning to crack. Now, here's where the story takes its first truly dark turn: the moment when organized crime revealed how deeply it had corrupted not just banks, but the very foundations of political power. As investigators closed in, Sindona didn't run. He fought back with a weapon most people never knew existed: blackmail. Remember those decades of money laundering? Remember all those legitimate businesses, politicians, and institutions that had knowingly or unknowingly participated in washing mafia money? Sindona had kept records. Everything: names, dates, amounts, account numbers. He began leaking hints that if prosecuted, he would expose a corruption network that reached into the highest levels of Italian government, the Vatican, and even American financial institutions. Suddenly, powerful people who had never considered themselves criminals realized they were trapped in a conspiracy decades in the making. This is the dark revelation that changes everything. The Mafia's money laundering operation hadn't succeeded because they were clever at hiding. It succeeded because the legitimate world was complicit. Banks earned fees on every transaction. Real estate developers didn't ask questions about cash buyers. Politicians received campaign contributions from businessmen who were fronts for organized crime. The line between legitimate business and criminal enterprise had blurred into non-existence. Sindona's desperation led to even darker places. In 1979, facing extradition to Italy on fraud charges, he staged his own kidnapping in New York, a theatrical attempt to buy time and generate sympathy. For 2 months, he claimed to be held captive by left-wing terrorists. In reality, he was hiding in Sicily under mafia protection, trying to negotiate deals that would save him from prosecution. When he finally reappeared, his credibility was destroyed. The fake kidnapping had been so poorly executed that even his allies abandoned him. He was extradited to Italy in 1984 to face charges of ordering the murder of Giorgio Ambrosoli, a lawyer investigating his financial crimes. The evidence was damning. Sindona had arranged for Ambrosoli to be shot dead outside his home. A cold execution designed to silence a man who knew too much about the money laundering empire. While awaiting trial, Sindona still held one final card: his knowledge. He possessed detailed information about the Vatican bank's involvement, about corrupt politicians, about the inner workings of the entire system. He hinted at cooperation with prosecutors, suggesting he might reveal everything in exchange for leniency. It was the last mistake he would ever make. On March 20th, 1986, Michele Sindona drank his morning coffee in his maximum security prison cell in Voghera, Italy. 2 days later, he was dead. The official cause: suicide by cyanide poisoning. The coffee had been laced with enough poison to kill him in minutes. But here's what makes this ending so chilling. Cyanide is not something you casually access in a maximum security Italian prison. Someone wanted Sindona silenced permanently, and they had the power to reach him even behind the thickest walls. To this day, many investigators believe his death was not suicide, but murder. A final message from the mafia, or from powerful figures in business and politics, who couldn't risk what he might reveal. His secrets died with him, buried in an unmarked grave, along with decades of evidence about who really profited from the mafia's money laundering empire. But the infrastructure he built, that was just getting started. While Sindona's story ended in poison and prison, his successor was already refining the system into something even more sophisticated and more deeply embedded in legitimate finance. Roberto Calvi, known as God's banker for his Vatican connections, inherited Sindona's network and transformed it into an even more complex web of offshore corporations, shell companies, and international transfers. Calvi ran Banco Ambrosiano, Italy's largest private bank, and used it as the centerpiece of a money laundering operation that made Sindona's work look primitive by comparison. He pioneered techniques that are now standard practice in money laundering, creating layers of offshore companies in Panama, Luxembourg, and the Bahamas, each owned by another shell company, creating ownership chains so complex that tracing the ultimate beneficial owner became virtually impossible. Mafia money would enter as deposits in Italian accounts, flow to offshore entities, get invested in legitimate businesses, and the profits would cycle back as dividends from foreign investments. Every step appeared legal on paper. Every transaction had documentation. The genius was in the complexity. The system was so convoluted that even expert forensic accountants couldn't untangle it without years of investigation. But Calvi made the same mistake as his predecessor. He believed his own invincibility. By the early 1980s, Banco Ambrosiano was hemorrhaging money. Somewhere between $1 and $1.5 billion had disappeared into the offshore network, much of it lost in bad loans to mafia-connected businesses that would never be repaid. When Italian banking regulators began investigating in 1982, they discovered a financial black hole. The Vatican Bank, still deeply entangled in the system, faced potential exposure to massive liability. Calvi tried to flee Italy, moving from country to country, trying to find safe harbor while negotiating with prosecutors, the Mafia, and Vatican officials simultaneously. Each group wanted something different from him: silence, money, testimony. He couldn't satisfy them all. On June 18, 1982, Calvi's body was found hanging from Blackfriars Bridge in London, his pockets stuffed with bricks and cash. The initial ruling: suicide. But the circumstances were bizarre. The location, the staging, the symbolic elements all suggested a ritualistic execution. Years later, after multiple investigations, Italian prosecutors concluded what many had suspected all along. Roberto Calvi was murdered by the Mafia. He knew too much, owed too much, and threatened too many powerful interests. Now we reach the second critical revelation, the moment that exposes the true depth of this financial conspiracy and why it matters far beyond the Mafia itself. When prosecutors finally began unraveling the Banco Ambrosiano collapse, they discovered something that changed their entire understanding of money laundering. The Mafia hadn't just corrupted the banking system, they had innovated it. The techniques developed by Sindona, Calvi, and their Mafia partners, offshore shell companies, layered transactions, correspondent banking networks, invoice manipulation, became the template that every major financial criminal organization would adopt. But more disturbing, these same techniques were adopted by legitimate corporations seeking to avoid taxes, by wealthy individuals hiding assets, by corrupt politicians moving bribes, by multinational companies shifting profits to tax havens. The Mafia had essentially written the playbook for modern financial secrecy. When you read today about Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, massive tax evasion schemes, you're seeing the descendants of the systems built by Sicilian gangsters in the 1960s and 70s. The methods are almost identical. Create complex ownership structures, exploit jurisdictions with weak regulation, use legitimate financial institutions as unwitting accomplices, and bury the paper trail so deep that investigation becomes economically impractical. The scale of what the Mafia achieved through these methods is almost impossible to comprehend. Between 1975 and 1985, during what became known as the Second Mafia War, Cosa Nostra laundered an estimated $100 billion. Some experts believe the number might be even higher. This wasn't money sitting idle. This was capital flowing through the real economy, buying real assets, influencing real markets. In Sicily, organized crime literally controlled the construction industry. Every building, every road, every public works project involved Mafia-connected companies using laundered money. The line between legitimate business and organized crime became meaningless. They were the same thing, just viewed from different angles. In New York, Los Angeles, and Miami, Mafia money purchased shopping centers, office buildings, and hotels that still operate today. The current owners might be completely legitimate, but the seed capital that built those properties came from heroin, extortion, and murder. This is the dark heart of the story. Criminal money doesn't stay criminal. Given enough time and enough washing, it becomes indistinguishable from any other capital in the system. The crackdown, when it finally came, revealed both the scale of the operation and the limitations of law enforcement against this type of sophisticated financial crime. The Maxi trial in Palermo, which ran from 1986 to 1992, was the largest criminal prosecution in Italian history. 474 defendants, charges ranging from murder to drug trafficking to, crucially, financial crimes and money laundering. The prosecution was led by Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, two magistrates who spent years reconstructing the Mafia's financial networks, from seized documents, wiretaps, and testimony from pentiti, Mafia turncoats who broke the Omerta code of silence. What Falcone discovered was revolutionary. You couldn't defeat organized crime just by prosecuting violence. You had to choke off the money. He pioneered following the money as an investigative technique, using financial forensics to map the entire structure of Cosa Nostra's business operations. The trial ended with 342 convictions, including 19 life sentences. It should have been a triumph. But victory came at an unbearable cost. On May 23, 1992, Giovanni Falcone was driving from the Palermo airport when 500 kilograms of explosives detonated beneath the highway, creating a crater so large it looked like a bomb site from a war zone. Falcone, his wife, and 3 police escorts were killed instantly. Less than 2 months later, on July 19th, a car bomb killed Paolo Borsellino and 5 police officers in downtown Palermo. The Mafia's message was clear. You can prosecute the soldiers, you can seize some assets, you can even win some trials. But if you truly threaten the money, if you expose the financial infrastructure that allows organized crime to function, you will pay with your life. The assassinations shocked Italy and the world, but they also revealed a disturbing truth about the nature of modern organized crime. The Mafia was no longer just a criminal organization. It was a financial institution willing to defend its interests with the same ruthlessness as any corporation protecting its market share. Except their methods involved explosives and murder rather than lawyers and lobbyists. In the aftermath of these assassinations, the Italian government finally implemented serious anti-money laundering legislation. Banks were required to report suspicious transactions. Financial intelligence units were created to analyze patterns. International cooperation increased through organizations like the Financial Action Task Force. Billions in Mafia assets were seized, real estate, businesses, bank accounts frozen and confiscated. Between 1992 and 2020, Italian authorities confiscated over 30 billion euros worth of Mafia-connected assets. It was the largest organized crime asset seizure in world history. The Sicilian Mafia's golden age of money laundering appeared to be over, but appearances can be deceiving. While the traditional banking routes became more difficult, the Mafia adapted with the same innovation that had built their empire in the first place. They moved into new sectors that were less regulated: online gambling, cryptocurrency exchanges, gold dealers, art markets, real estate in countries with weak anti-money laundering controls. They partnered with other criminal organizations: Russian oligarchs, Chinese triads, Mexican cartels, creating global networks that made the old Vatican bank connections look provincial by comparison. Today's money laundering operations are simultaneously more sophisticated and more dispersed than anything Sindona or Calvi could have imagined. Modern organized crime doesn't rely on a few corrupt bankers anymore. They exploit vulnerabilities in the entire global financial system. Trade-based money laundering using inflated invoices, bulk cash smuggling through international couriers, cyber-enabled transfers through multiple jurisdictions, investment in legitimate businesses as silent partners hiding behind legal corporate structures. Financial intelligence experts estimate that between 2 and 5% of global GDP, somewhere between $800 billion and $2 trillion annually, is laundered money flowing through the legitimate economy. Not all of it is mafia money anymore, of course. Drug cartels, human traffickers, corrupt politicians, tax evaders, sanctions violators. They all use variations of the same techniques pioneered by those Sicilian gangsters 50 years ago. The infrastructure remains. The methods endure. Only the players have changed. But perhaps the darkest lesson from this entire business scandal is how the mafia's innovations became normalized in legitimate finance. Offshore shell companies, standard practice for multinational corporations, complex ownership chains, called tax optimization when done by tech giants, moving money through multiple jurisdictions to obscure its origin. That's just international banking. The techniques developed by criminals to hide drug money are now taught in business schools as legitimate strategies for asset protection and corporate restructuring. Major banks, HSBC, Wachovia, Deutsche Bank, and others, have paid billions in fines for facilitating money laundering, yet none of their executives served significant prison time. When a mafia accountant launders money, it's organized crime. When a major bank does the exact same thing at 1,000 times the scale, it's a compliance violation that gets settled with a fine. The mafia didn't just corrupt the financial system, they revealed how corruptible it already was. The Sicilian Mafia still exists, though in a much diminished form compared to their height of power in the 1970s and 80s. They still launder money, still run criminal enterprises, still use violence when necessary. But they're no longer the innovators they once were. That distinction has passed to other players in the global economy, some criminal, some corporate, some governmental, who use the same fundamental techniques to move money in secret. The real legacy of the mafia's money laundering empire isn't in the billions they washed or the banks they corrupted. It's in the system they helped create. A global financial architecture where opacity is profitable, complexity provides cover, and the line between legal and illegal becomes increasingly meaningless as long as you have the right lawyers and the right connections. Michele Sindona and Roberto Calvi both died violent deaths. Their empires collapsed. Their names became synonyms for financial corruption. But their methods survived, evolved, went mainstream. In a vault somewhere, there's probably still a ledger like the one found in Palermo all those years ago. Perhaps it's in a law firm in Panama, or a private bank in Zurich, or a corporate headquarters in Delaware. The names have changed. The sums have grown larger. But the fundamental transaction remains the same, transforming dirty money into clean assets, invisibly, efficiently, and with the implicit cooperation of institutions that benefit from looking the other way. That ledger is still being written, page after page, day after day. And just like that first one discovered in Sicily, it contains a truth that most people would prefer to remain hidden. The mafia didn't just learn how to do business. They taught the rest of the world something far more valuable: how to make morality invisible, one transaction at a time. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.